Today is January 22nd, 1998. This is tape one with Mr. Harry Weiss. I'm Florence Schuster. We're in Kew Gardens, New York, USA. This interview is in English. This is tape one with Mr. Harry Weiss in Kew Gardens, New York. Today is January 22nd, 1998. Could you please tell us your name?
Harry Weiss.
And could you spell it?
Harryweiss.
And have you ever been known by any other names?
On my birth certificate, it's marked Hermann Hirsch Selig.
And how did your name change come about?
I frankly didn't like my name, and when I became a citizen of the United States, I legally changed my name to Harry.
And where were you born?
Wiesbaden, Germany.
Could you spell that?
Wiesbaden.
And when is your birthday?
June 27, 1929.
And how old does that make you now?
68.
What is your father's name?
Haskell Schrager.
And your mother's name?
Zipporah.
And her maiden name?
Stimmler.
And did you have any brothers and sisters?
Yes, I had three brothers, Oscar, Jack, and Moshe.
And what is their age ranking?
I think that Oscar, who passed away about 15 years ago, he was about 1.25 years, 15 months younger than I. Jack is about 3 years younger than I, and Moshe is 9 years younger than I.
And what are your grandparents' names?
My father's side was Zeidy Weiss, and my grandmother's name was Chaya. On my mother's side, my grandfather's name was Pinchas Meyer Stimmler, and my grandmother's name was Cyril Brandl.
And where were they born?
For my father's side, they were born in Kolbuschowa in Galicia, and in my mother's side, they were born in Brigl, also in Galicia.
And what country is that?
Galicia is a portion of the old Austria-Hungary Empire, later on annexed to Poland.
Tell me a little bit about your early childhood and where you lived.
I was born, as I said before, in Wiesbaden. I must have been about 1.5 years old or 2 years old when we moved to Frankfurt. We lived in Frankfurt in a very nice apartment, about a block away from the Breuer Synagogue, which was on the Anlagen. And most people know the Breuer Synagogue, which was from the Breuer dynasty. I don't remember too much about my actual growing up in the youth, but at the age of about 6, I started singing in the choir in the Breuer Synagogue, and I also started the Jüdische Volksschule, which was equivalent to what we call a yeshiva in nowadays United States. And I went there for maybe 1 year, and then of course the problems began for us, and we had to leave.
Let's go back to your home that you do remember. Do you have any memory at all of your home in Wiesbaden?
None whatsoever.
So your home in Frankfurt. Do you remember the address?
Yes, the address was number 8 Hanauer Landstraße, which was a very nice neighborhood.
Tell me about the neighborhood.
As I said before, we were about a block around the corner from the Breuer Synagogue, and that was on a street called Anlagen, which was like a semi-park trees, benches. So we had a relatively pleasant place. 2 blocks or 3 blocks away from where we lived was the Beis HaMedrash, or the Stiebel, that my father attended, and that was that was on the Lange Straße, and it was called the Klausner Synagogue. I suppose Klausner was the one that started it. I remember going with my father many times as a little boy. Across the street from the Klausner Schule was a movie house. I remember looking at the pictures on the outside advertising the movie, and I think I may have even seen a Shirley Temple film there.
Can you describe what your home looked like?
I remember in the bathroom there was over the tub a very large built-in oven in order to give us constant hot water, which was probably in lieu of what we call today a steam heat. I remember a maid's room with a maid. I think we lived up on the second floor. Not too much more.
How many apartments were in the building?
Oh, I don't remember exactly, but it was probably 5, 6 stories high, and there must have been at least 1 or 2 apartments on each floor, but I'm not too sure. Downstairs at the in the building there was a coffee shop, and I remembered vividly a sign on the door that said "Juden und Hunde verboten," which meant we were not allowed to be there. And I do recall also that there was like a courtyard with a gate in front. And one time I recall my father and I were walking out into the street, and we heard a motorcade coming along, and I wanted to watch it. And my father said, "No, you better get in, because if you stand outside, you must make the Hitler salute. And since we're Jewish, we're not allowed to do it, so we better get out of here."
How did you sit around the table when you sat down to have dinner?
I cannot recall. I cannot recall.
What is your earliest memory?
Spotty at best. Maybe because I shoveled it under the carpet. Probably did. I remember I was a very wild child. Uh, I don't recall much of my childhood, one way or the other, bad or good.
Do you remember celebrating a Passover?
No, no, I do not. I don't remember celebrating any holiday. The only thing I do remember is going with my father to shul once in a while, and my father being a Bal Tfilah, or Chazan, if you will, and I remember helping him along, uh, but nothing much more.
Do you remember any food your mother used to cook for you?
No, not at those days. My memory gets stronger as I get older, but in Frankfurt itself, I don't recall too much of, of my youth.
Do you remember how the apartment was heated?
Probably with that, what we call ein Wasserkessel, which was the kettle, that large kettle over the tub. It was filled with water, and gas heated the water, and I assume that's how the apartment was heated. For sure, the hot water came from there. So I must imagine probably was part of that heating system.
Do you remember how many rooms there were to the apartment?
No,
Do you remember the keys to unlock the door?
No.
Do you remember going on any summer vacations?
Actually not. I do recall that my younger brother, the one that passed away, he was sent away to summer camp, and I was not. But I do recall that at one time my mother went to visit her parents who lived in Hamburg, and I was placed with my aunt in Mainz, my aunt and uncle in Mainz, who was she was my father's sister.
And their names?
Uh, Brandstätter. Brandstätter. And I recalled Mainz being about, I'd say, 20 miles outside of Frankfurt. And there was a trolley car that ran from Frankfurt to Mainz. And after a few days, I said I had enough. And without telling anyone, I picked myself up and I took the trolley car back to Frankfurt. I must have been about 5 or 6 years old. And I recall coming to look for my father. And of course, I found him in the Klausner Schule or Klausner Besmetrich. And I came in and I remember my father putting his hands on his head and saying, "Du hast mir gemacht einen Strich durch die Rechnung," which in translation means, "You put a line right through my invoice. You killed my day." I suppose that he had other plans, and I just killed it for him by coming home.
What happened?
I wouldn't know, but I probably, as I said to you, was a pretty wild fellow. I mean, for a youngster, and I must have been fairly smart to take at 5 or 6 years old to take a 20-mile trip with a trolley and knowing where I was going. So I don't know what happened. Unfortunately, my aunt and uncle never had children until they were deported into Poland, and they had two children, in fact, in 1941 or 42, and they were all killed by the Nazis. But during the time when I was there, they were married many, many years, and they had no children, and I guess they didn't know how to handle me, not being experienced. And when I said I had enough, I had enough.
What were their first names?
Uh, my aunt's name was Reisel, and my uncle's name I do not recall.
Do you remember going to school?
I remember that I went to school. I remember practicing my name to write my name because we wrote it in the Gothic German. But I don't recall classrooms. And I don't know really how long I went to school. It couldn't have been very long, according to chronological order.
Well, what was school like for the first year that you went?
Truth of the matter is, I don't recall. I don't recall. All I recall is that I went to school. I went to the Jüdische Volksschule. What I did there, I don't know.
Did you take your notes on pencil and paper or on a chalkboard?
I really don't recall. I probably must have written it on paper and pencil or pen because when I ran out of paper, I wrote on the walls. My mother always lamented that I wrote my name all over the walls in the living room. How true that is, I don't know, but that's what she said. Smart boy.
Do you remember what your living room looked like?
No, no, I do not.
Do you remember where you slept?
Um, no. I do not.
Do you remember when your brother was born?
No, I do not. I remember only the memory of a sibling being born is I only remember the youngest one who was born in 1938, which makes me, as I said before, about 9 years older than him. And I remember him being born, exactly the procedure and what happened and the bris and all these things. I do not recall.
What are your earliest memories?
Um, I do have memories spotty, very spotty. As I mentioned to you, I remembered going to my aunt and uncle in Mainz. I remember singing in the Breuer Shul. I remember in the Breuer Shul Friday night, the rabbi blessing all the children from the choir and others who walked down the aisle. This I remember. Uh, I remember. I remember once walking with my mother across the Zeil, which is equivalent to Main Street in most towns where the businesses are, and I just laid down in the middle of the street. I said, I'm not going any further. That's it. As I said, it's spotty. Nothing on a continuous basis, nothing cohesive, just spotty here and there. As I grew older, um, as we went from one city to another, things probably, I remember the odds and ends and maybe just incidences. But
Do you remember any of the games that you played as a child?
no, not really. I do remember once that I got hold of some money, maybe not the kosher way, and I bought a target practicing gun, with a suction cup in the front. That I do recall, but nothing really.
Was your home kosher?
Absolutely.
Do you remember any food being served to you?
No, no. By nature, I was always hungry, and I frankly didn't care what I ate as long as I ate, as long as I filled up my stomach. That has been my. There's nothing really that I should say that something very a delicacy of some sort. No, I do remember one other incident that my father, Oliver Sholem, took me Fridays to the fish market. It was still dark outside, so it must have been very early every Friday to buy fish for Shabbos. This I recall. At least once or twice. He took me, I would imagine it was many more times than that. But he took me to the fish market.
Did you buy a live fish or a dead fish?
Live fish.
Do you remember the fish being prepared or the fish swimming at home?
At home, no. I think that the fish was alive in the tank, and it was prepared in the fish place, in the fish store. It wasn't a store really. The way it seems to me, it was like an underground halle or a hall of some sort, and it probably was prepared there. And we took it home already prepared, and my mother cooked it. She didn't have to do the cleaning. I don't think she would have.
What are your memories of your mother?
Uh, I don't recall too much of my mother in those years. Most of my memories of my mother are when I was older. I I sometimes think of myself uh, as there's a political organization in Israel called Achshav, now, today, Shalom Achshav, and I think of myself in those terms. I live today, I remember today, and my life really began when I got married. So it seems to me that what went on before is spotty, but my real life is once I'm married.
Do you remember any anti-Semitism you experienced in Frankfurt?
Well, number one, I remembered the store in the house where we lived in, which didn't permit any Jews to come in. That is called Juden und Hunde verboten. That's one. Number two, I recall the motorcade, the SA, which is the brown shirts coming down the street, and my father pulling me back into the house, saying you cannot stand outside because you're going to get into trouble. That's number two. I recall that my father had a business, and slowly but surely they strangled the business. He couldn't go out and do the business. He couldn't collect money because he was Jewish, and eventually he had to give up the business that I recall. I recall my father and my mother having arguments because my mother told my father that we have to leave. And my father said, well, number one, we have no place where to go. And number two, he won't last forever. Churchill and Chamberlain are not going to let him get away with it. And of course, there's a Maginot Line. The Maginot Line was a supposed line going across the France and Belgium and Holland, where the German tanks couldn't pass. And therefore they were stymied, and therefore Hitler wouldn't get any place. And above all, we were Polish citizens. So what are they going to do to us Polish citizens? We're going to go to our consulate, and they'll protect us. Of course, none of this helped. But that's part of the anti-Semitism that I recall. Actually, I was too young really to feel that anti-Semitism as an adult would.
Did you have any contact with Gentile children?
None.
When were you requested to leave school, stop attending school?
I don't know whether we were asked to leave the school, keeping in mind that I went to a Jewish school. Uh, I think what happened was that in 1939, after the Kristallnacht and after the deportation of the Polish Jews to Poland, life just fell apart, and people began to scramble to either get out or do the best they can. I don't think it was any concentrated effort at leaving school or something like that. I just think things fell apart.
Kristallnacht occurred in November of '38. What do you recall about that?
Um, the only I'm not too sure of where I was, but I do remember that prior to Kristallnacht, the French, the ambassador, the German ambassador to France, was killed by a Polish Jew called Greenspan.
Do you recall this?
From history books, not on a personal level. But I do recall that after this killing, the Germans took all Polish citizens and sent them back to Poland. And we were Polish citizens. And it just so happens that my father and my mother argued again over leaving Germany, and finally my mother prevailed. And my father went to his in-laws, my mother's parents, who lived in Hamburg. And Hamburg was not only a port, an ocean port, but because of that, also they had many embassies and consulates there. And he went to buy, get visas to different countries to see what he can do. While he was in Hamburg, the Kristall, not the Kristallnacht, but the killing happened in Paris. And the following morning, which was a Thursday morning at 4 a.m., the Gestapo came to our house and told us we must leave. I was up, I recall this. My mother told him, I have no passports. My husband is not here. My husband left out of town, and we have no passports. We cannot go. So the police said, or the Gestapo said, okay, make sure that he brings back the passports. You must leave Frankfurt no later than Saturday morning. My mother contacted my father in Hamburg, and in Hamburg the same thing happened as in Frankfurt, which meant that they took all the Polish citizens and sent them back to Poland, including my grandparents, including my aunts and uncles that were there. They were not aware of my father. My father was laying under a bed. They were not aware he was there. So they didn't find him. She called him, or he called her. I don't know how the conversation went. But my father went to Switzerland via Frankfurt. And Friday night, must have been maybe 10, 11 o'clock at night, the train went through Frankfurt. Someone went to the train station, picked up the passports. My father continued to Switzerland as a fugitive, and we got the passports. Saturday morning, we boarded the train, and we went to Poland. On that train, since we went first class, was a German officer, an army officer. And he seemed to be very sympathetic towards us. He gave us children bananas and other fruits that he had with him. So I recall. We arrived at the Polish border at 1 o'clock a.m., Sunday morning. The Polish citizens en masse were brought to this border, and they were let into Poland until 12 o'clock midnight. 12 o'clock midnight, Saturday night, the Polish closed the border and would not take anyone else in. When we arrived, there were tens of thousands of Polish Jews on the border in no man's land, waiting to cross or waiting to go back and didn't know what to do. And we waited many, many hours until other trains came on Sunday morning, and we were permitted to go back to our cities. Many came from other cities in Frankfurt. We went back to Frankfurt. Our apartment was closed up by the Gestapo. It was sealed. We couldn't get in. The children were brought to the hospitals, Jewish hospitals, for sleeping purposes. And the adults were quartered in the Jewish schools, where they put straws on the floor, straws and mattresses. And we stayed there, I do not recall how long, but after a day or 2 or 3, I don't know, the Gestapo opened up the apartment, and we were able to re-enter our apartment.
We're going to change tape.
Okay.
This is tape 2 on January 22nd, 1998, with Mr. Harry Weiss. Mr. Weiss, when you were sent to Spongine, was that on the German side of the border with Poland?
No, Spongine was a border town on the Polish side. When we arrived at the train station at the end of the line for Germany, we were on the train station itself, and I believe it was part of the no man's land. There were no trains going back to Germany, and the Polish didn't let us go into Poland, and we were just stuck. Stymie.
Who was with you?
My mother and my 3 siblings, and also my father's brother and his wife.
And what was their name?
His name was Tzvi Weiss, and her name escapes me.
And where was your father at this point?
In Switzerland.
Do you remember any of the conversations you had while you were waiting?
Yes. My younger brother, of course, they were all younger than I am. My younger brother, or let me step back a moment. There were so many people there, so many tens of thousands of people, that my mother and I held on to the 2 children. One she held in her arms, that was my youngest brother Moshe. He must have been several months old. And then there was Jack and Oscar. And I held on to one and she held on to the other. And Oscar wanted to tear himself away, Ich gehe suchen Papa, which meant I'm going to look for Daddy. And we knew, would he tear himself away from us, we'll never see him again. It was just impossible to find him. And we had all to do just to hold on to him. And I remember my mother telling me that I was very grown up and I behaved admirably, and she promised me a wristwatch. In those days, a wristwatch was a very important thing, and of course it was a sign of maturity. I felt very proud.
Who was administering the orders to you at this time?
There were no orders per se. It was just we were standing there and we were milling around. It's like a crowd, a mob. Not a crowd, it was a mob. And no one knew what to do until finally I assumed that an announcement was made over the PA system that trains will arrive and they will take the people back to their cities and towns. And I recall that on the way back, first we went, going to Poland, we went first class. Obviously, coming back, we were just tourist class and just hard benches. On every station that the train stopped, German Jews were there with food, clothing, medicine. I'll never forget that. Keeping in mind that the German Jews always felt themselves a few steps higher than the Ostjuden. But we were Jews, and they were very helpful.
Tell me more about that distinction amongst the Eastern Jews and the German Jews.
German Jews are those Jews that were in Germany for several generations. And they had the education, and they had the money, and they felt themselves the elite. The Eastern European Jews, which were the Polish Jews, the Russian Jews, the Hungarian Jews, they came primarily to Germany because they couldn't make a living where they lived, which included my father and included many, many people. The living situation in Poland was a terrible state. People were literally starving. So they came to Germany, many illegals, and even those that came legally couldn't get work because you had to have a permit to work, so they worked illegally. And they were looked down upon by the local gentry, the German Jews. And that was a distinction that remained I would assume that it's not only among the Jews, but as well among the Gentiles, that the so-called elite, the English, the French, the Western European gentry or Gentiles, look down on the Poles and the Russians and the Ukrainians because they're not educated and they don't have money, and they're what we call prostakas.
You were born in Germany, though.
Absolutely.
Did you consider yourself a German Jew?
I don't recall what I consider myself. I was too young to consider myself anything. Uh, it seems to me that my father never considered himself a German Jew. He always considered himself a Galician Yid. And I think that that is true in most cases where people, uh, if they have no choice, then they try to bring out the best in their standards, in their statute, in their what was the word I'm looking for? In where they stand in life.
What I'm unclear of is how you consider yourself.
I never considered myself a German Jew. Not then, which I really don't know. I really don't know what I consider myself then. But certainly, since I can recall, since I was married and I live now in Kew Gardens, I never considered myself a German Jew. I always identify with the Eastern Europeans.
Um, what were the circumstances when you came back to Frankfurt?
Uh, as I mentioned before, the children were put into the hospitals for sleeping purposes and for care. The adults went to the Jewish schools where they laid out the sleeping quarters. I went with my mother as an adult. And I recall that a few days later, after we went to our apartment, whether I recall it as fact or as fiction, I do not recall. But I think that I saw them burning the Breuer synagogue. It was burned. There's no question about it. Whether I actually saw it or whether I identified with it, I don't know. But I think I saw it, since it was only a block away from us.
And then what happened?
We knew at that time that we had no place any longer in Germany.
And when exactly is this now?
This was the end of 1938.
Do you remember anything about Kristallnacht?
Not really. I don't even know whether I was in Germany during Kristallnacht. My mother does remember. My mother was there. What has happened was, I don't recall exactly, but sometime after we came back from Poland, I was sent to my father in Switzerland.
Do you know how that came about?
Not really. I know I went to Switzerland. I don't know how that came about, but I do recall that from Switzerland I was sent to France, where my family lived, my father's family. They lived in Strasbourg. And I was smuggled over the border on a forged passport. I was told that the passport was a girl's passport, so therefore I had to keep my mouth closed, make believe I was sleeping, and I put on a girl's coat and cap, and the train passed through the border during the middle of the night. I recall the inspector or the customs man, I don't know which country, looked at the passport which was attached to my coat, looked at it, and stamped it, and I continued. But I was awake, and I knew exactly what was happening.
Do you remember receiving any instructions about what to do in case you were identified as a Jew?
No.
Did you have any inkling of what was happening to Jews?
Yes. I don't forget I was in Poland, or at the border of Poland. I knew that the apartment was closed. I knew that the Gestapo was chasing Jews. I know that my father had to run to Switzerland. I was intelligent enough to know what was going on. Maybe not fully. Maybe I didn't understand the ramifications of what would happen, but I certainly knew that would I be discovered as smuggling over the border on a someone else's passport, I'd be in big trouble. That's for sure.
Do you know the name under that passport that you
No,
used?
no, I do not. I didn't know at the time either.
Do you recall any other anti-Jewish measures? Did you see anybody being subjected to anti-Semitic activity?
Not on a personal level. I knew about it. I knew about it. Being the oldest in my of the children, I heard my parents speak about it, but I didn't feel any real anti-Semitic discrimination.
What did they speak about?
They spoke about the troubles. They spoke about the fact that there was my father's business was going to pot because a law was passed that Gentiles need not pay their bills to Jews, and my father was in a wholesale business where he gave merchandise on credit. He sold it to different stores, and he eventually, in the beginning, they still paid some of them, but eventually he knew this was coming to an end. And when my father went to Hamburg, he bought visas to every South American country that he could, South and Central American country. When I say bought, I mean that probably he paid off the consulates in order to give him this visa. We had no way of knowing yet how we're going to get there because we were still in Germany at that time, but at least he had the visas.
Were you a financially secure family prior to the war?
Prior to the war, yes. Yes, my father had a car with a chauffeur. My mother had a maid for the children, a maid for the house, a maid for the heavy-duty work, and she was a lady of leisure, yes.
Tell me what happened.
After I went to Strasbourg, France, in which my grandfather, my father's father, lived. He lived in a daughter's house, my father's sister's house, and I was sent there. What transpired during that time, I do not know, but I do know that my mother tried and probably did liquidate as much as she could. She sold the car, she sold some of the furniture, and of course you couldn't take any of the money out, but some of it she took out with her. And we finally met in Strasbourg. And after meeting in Strasbourg, we stayed there for a few days, and we went to a port called La Rochelle.
Your brothers were with you?
Yes, we were all together. And in La Rochelle, my father went to a ship company, and he asked them, "Do you have a ship going across the Atlantic?" And they said, "Yes, we have one going to Cuba." My father says, "Fine, I have a visa to Cuba." And we boarded the ship.
Tell me about the trip.
Uh, what stands out in my mind, really stands out in my mind, was the saying goodbye at the train station in Strasbourg, where my grandfather, who had a beard, payas, standing there and saying to my father, Chaskel, mit wem hast du dich mishadach sein? Meaning, you're going to a country like Cuba. And Cuba was really a banana republic, or close to it. And this was end station, and you have 4 sons. Who are you going to marry them off to? What are you going to do? What kind of schooling are you giving? What kind of yeshiva are you going to give him? And he lamented this fact, not that he was going because he knew he had to go, but the fact of where he was going and what the future held. And I recall my mother taking off a necklace that she wore, which she took along with her in order to have something to live on. And she took it off and she gave it to my grandfather. And she said to him, Schwer, du hatte, it überleben. Which meant, here you'll have what to live on. And he did. This necklace helped him survive through most of the war in France. And we went to Cuba. And we arrived in Cuba, for all intents and purposes, without money. Without anything. And in Cuba, the Joint Committee supported us.
Where did you live?
We lived in a part of Havana which is called Havana Vieja, which is the old part of Havana. Probably the cheapest rentals that you can find. We had no gas. My mother cooked on briquettes, coals. But we were together, and we survived. My father was not permitted to work because the refugees, if they worked, they took away the work from the local inhabitants. So he was not allowed to work. What he did, I don't recall. I didn't go to school either. I don't know why. But
What did you do then?
that's an excellent question. I really don't know. A little later on, a man came to Cuba. His name was Moshe Cohn, who happened to have been a cousin to my father-in-law. Of course, we were talking about a time when I was 9 years old or 10 years old. So, but the families knew each other. And he was a learned man, and he used to learn with me Chumash, Rashi, things like that. And he took me, so to speak, under his wing. But I may have gone to school. I don't know. I don't recall.
Did you learn to speak Spanish?
Oh, yes. Within 2 weeks, 4 weeks, I spoke perfect Spanish. Children pick up languages very fast. I played with the kids on the street, with Cuban kids, I would imagine.
What type of dress had you worn in Frankfurt?
Knicker pants, which was Knickerhosen. Probably cap, shirt. I don't never paid much attention to that.
Did you wear a skull cap?
No, no one wore a skull cap in Germany. I think we wore a skull cap maybe at home, but on the street for sure not. We wore a cap. We didn't wear a skull cap in Havana either. I remember we came off the boat, Havana, thinking about back what it looked like. It must have been really a real island in the Caribbean, which it is. We got off the boat and we were wearing knicker pants with long socks, with the caps, And I recall the Cuban kids on the street hollering, Judío, Polaco, which was not it meant Jewish Polak, but it wasn't meant as a discriminating name. It was just stranger, like a greenhorn. And eventually, I suppose, we changed, took off most of our European clothes and wore lightweight clothes. It was warm in Cuba.
And how long did you stay in Cuba?
We stayed in Cuba 22 months.
Did you find there was a large Jewish community there?
Yes. Cuba had a community of about 20,000 Jews. And I think most of them were Polish Jews who immigrated to Cuba in the early 20s, probably for the same reason that the Jews immigrated to Germany. They couldn't make a living in Poland, so they came to Cuba. And most of them were doing very well financially. The only problem we had was that in Cuba, although there were two shuls, there was not one Sabbath observer, except for one Turkish Jew. There was not one Sabbath observer. And it must have been very difficult for us, I can imagine.
Tell me about that.
We came to Cuba in 1939. From 1933 on, there was no shechita in Cuba, in Germany, which means there was no slaughtering of animals. And all the meat that was brought in from Holland, which were chickens. And naturally, when we came to Cuba, we thought here was a place where we can have meat. It's a natural food, and people are hungry for it, especially since we saw that the shochet in Cuba had a long beard. He was called Riven Shochet. But my father, being who he was, and some other people who were refugees decided, yes, we'll eat from this shochet, but we're going to have our own hashkucha, or meaning our own watchman, to make sure that the meat is slaughtered properly, the butcher shop is controlled, and they agreed. And within the first week, my father went into the butcher shop in the morning, as he's supposed to do, and he saw two tongues were hanging on the rack. And he knew that only one cow was slaughtered that day. There was no refrigeration. This was Cuba. This is, you slaughtered every day, or the days that you want to eat meat. My father went to the other mashgiach and said to him, how many cows were slaughtered today? So his name was Mendel Kresh, and he said, one. I was there in the slaughterhouse. So my father said, there are two tongues hanging in the butcher shop. So both he and my father went to Rabbi Kaplan, who was the rabbi of Havana. And they said to him, Rabbi Kaplan, we know that one cow was slaughtered today. There are two tongues hanging in the butcher shop. Can you explain this? So he said, Senor Weiss, in Cuba is Farana Mo, a behemoth zwei Zungen. Translated means, in Cuba is a possibility that a cow has two tongues, kosher. Needless to say, that was the end. And we didn't have any more meat. Later on came a shochet from a refugee, and he slaughtered chickens, and that's what we ate. But we didn't touch anything anymore from the local community. The local community was very strong in Jewish feelings, newspaper, radio, stage, books, very strong, but not in religion. And in Cuba is where I learned how to speak Yiddish. In Cuba, I learned how to read and write Yiddish. And for many, many years, I read only Yiddish books. I read all of Sholem Aleichem in Yiddish. I was pretty good at it. Unfortunately, I didn't continue with it in the United States.
Were you aware of what was happening to the European Jewry?
No, not at all. I don't think anyone was aware. We became aware after we came to the United States.
And when did you come to the United States?
We came to the United States in January 1941. And the war, of course, started for the United States in December 1941. And no one knew. We knew there was a war going on. We knew that the Germans oppressed the Jews. But I don't think anyone was really aware of concentration camps. Although I wouldn't say that. We knew there was a concentration camp called Dachau in Germany. But Treblinka and Auschwitz and the other place, no one knew about it. Until 1942, I think, or 1943, the Jewish radio station began to announce of what was happening. But I really don't believe anyone believed them. Everybody said that was propaganda. I don't think anyone believed it. Who can believe such a thing? Who can believe such a thing? You know, you write to people, you expect them to write back. My parents wrote to their parents, they never got a reply. We said, because it's a war. That's why there's no mail. There are two enemies fighting, the East and the West, the Germans and the Americans. So that's why there's no mail. But a Holocaust, I don't think most people believe it.
We're going to change tapes.
Okay.
This is tape 3 on January 22nd, 1998, with Mr. Harry Weiss in Kew Gardens, Queens, New York. Mr. Weiss, I just wanted to clarify. I was unclear when I asked you. I was unclear of the actual date that you had gone to the United States. Um, so when I asked you what you were aware of in Cuba, I didn't realize that were still there and it was just 41 until you came to the United States. Because the extermination didn't happen until 42. But what I wanted to ask you was, were you aware in New York, when you were in the United States, uh, of not necessarily the gassing that was going on, but all of the anti-Jewish measures that were going on?
I don't know whether I was aware of the anti-Jewish measures, any new ones. We had enough anti-Jewish measures from 1933 up to the time that we left Germany. And we knew that they were not being rescinded. We had thought probably that they went as far as they could go with their anti-Jewish measures. We never believed that they would do anything of the sort that they did. I guess human nature is such that we believe when it reaches a certain level, that's it, and then it'll become better. We do know, though, and I can recall for myself that Poland and Russia and Lithuania and all these places were poor places to live in. And there's a lot of poverty and destitution there. And we assumed that those people that came from, not only those that lived there, but those others that were expelled from Germany and were forced to live now in the ghettos of Poland, must be having a very, very difficult time, and not living in the same type of apartments or quarters, or having the same food or anything. But the social amenities that they had in Germany, they surely didn't have in Poland. So it must have been a very difficult time. So even without thinking in terms of killings, or without thinking in terms of concentration camps, we felt very badly for those people that wound up in Poland. And I do recall something that they said it was a very, very hard winter. The 40s, the winters were very cold, extremely cold, and we were wondering how they were making out. Not even thinking further of what actually happened later on, but just thinking in terms of human feeling, of social feeling. How were they managing? And we knew that was a difficult thing.
Where were you when you found out the war was over?
Oh, that was 1945. I was in New York. Uh, I don't remember exactly where I was at the time, but I must have been going to school. And the jubilation, I guess, overshadows everything else. It was a tremendous thing, a tremendous thing.
And what did you do after the war?
Uh, on what level are you asking this question?
Personally, what did you do?
Well, we in the United States, in retrospect, in retrospect to what happened in Europe, we were extremely well off. But for us here in the United States, life was very difficult. My father was a well-to-do man in Europe. When he came here, he could do nothing but work for someone because he needed to put bread on the table. He never had enough money nor enough time to go back into business. So therefore, he worked and he was just making a living. And my mother, who was a lady in Europe, now sat as an operator on a machine and sewed sweaters in order to bring home some dollars. I, who was already a big boy at that time, I must have been at least 13, 14, went to work after school and on Sundays to bring home a few dollars myself. And with all that, it was almost impossible to make ends meet.
And did your brothers go to school?
Yes, they went to school, as I did, but they were much younger than I, at least maybe not in years, but in their I don't know the right word for this. They were they seemed younger than I. They seemed less involved in life as I. I was my mother's confidant because my father was always out working, and I always felt way ahead of them. Still do.
Did you lose family members in Europe?
Unfortunately, I lost from my mother's side. I lost I think half of my aunts and uncles. There were 10 children. I think 5 of them or 6 of them never came back.
Do you remember their names?
My computer is slow. As I go along, I'll probably remember. But I remember one very tragic part of that is I had an aunt called Sarah, and she was my mother's sister, and she lost a husband and 4 girls. And she never, during her entire life, believed that they were all dead. And her entire life was spent looking for them. She probably died about roughly 15 years ago. That makes it 98, 73, 1973. So she was looking for them from 1943 until 1973. In Israel, in Europe, went through lists, never gave up. Of course, we did, but she never believed they were all dead. She lost a husband and 4 children. And from my father's side, although my grandfather was living in Free France because I have cousins who were fighting in the French Marquis during the war, my aunts and uncles and cousins were not so fortunate, and they were transported by the French to Auschwitz, and they died. They were killed from Strasbourg.
How has the war affected your life?
Uh, how can I say that it affected me deeply when I see others who lost everything? And I remained with everything. The only thing I can say is sometimes I mention to someone is if someone loses a finger and the other person loses an arm, the one that lost the arm is very bad off. The one that lost a finger has another 4 fingers, but he has a tragedy. He lost a finger. It may not be as bad as the fellow who lost the arm, but he did lose a finger. And this is how I feel. I sometimes feel very apologetic about it uh, because many of my friends, most of my friends, went through concentration camps, and they had a personal tragedies. But I'm grateful that I came out, so to speak, unscathed. Had I remained in Germany, had there not been Hitler, I probably would have gone to school. I would have learned either a trade or a profession. Uh, at this stage of the game, it wouldn't make any difference. But in my early years, I struggled. I struggled very, very hard because I did not have the education to make it. It was a very tough time for many, many, many years. So I think that's what it did for me personally. But in the scheme of things, I was much better off than most of my contemporaries.
Is there a message you would like to leave your children?
Well, I think I am the kind of parent, as they know, that I don't wait for my death or for my demise to leave them messages. I give them messages every day. And they know how I feel. I've written them all letters. They're all waiting for them to read. The only message, the real message that I have is we went through enough wars and we need peace among our own. And my kids should not fight, not argue. Step back. Step back from the brink. Don't fight. Give in. Each and every one of them. Give in. Give in to the other. But that's the only message that I have. Don't fight.
I'd like to hear how you met your wife.
My favorite subject. Uh, we were a group of boys who met every Saturday on Lee Avenue, on Bedford Avenue, sorry, Bedford Avenue. And there were a bunch of girls, about I think 6 or 7 girls, who used to meet together in the Young Israel. And it was a very cold Shabbos, and we went into the Young Israel, and the boys met the girls, and I happened to know one of the girls. Her name was Regina Pinta. And I knew her because her father and my father sat at the same table in shul. And she always was a pretty girl. And what does a fellow want more than to walk around with a pretty girl? So we talked and we schmoozed, and we hit it off right away. It wasn't as if we were strangers. We knew each other, and and we hit it off. We hit it off right away. But since we were the same age, she was ready to settle down, and I knew my father wouldn't let me settle down. What is an 18-year-old boy going to settle down with? I had nothing. I had no money. I had no business. I had nothing. No independence. So we we were very good friends, even though she went out dating, and she told me about all her dates. And she asked me, and we talked about it. But in my heart, I always wanted that she should wait for me, and she did. And she did.
What? How did you support yourself?
Um, my father was on the job, working as he was doing for many years in America. And while he was on the job, his boss sent him to deliver something, and it was a rainy day, and he slipped and broke an arm. And because he broke the arm, he couldn't work, and he got compensation money. With that money, he went into business. And because he went into business and he was trying to build himself up, naturally, I was the willing help that he needed. Although I was a young kid of 14, 15, I left school and I worked with him. He bought, we sold, and eventually we grew in the business, and I worked for my father. And my father didn't feel it necessary to give me independence because why should he give me independence? I was a good workhorse. So I worked for my father. When I got married, I worked for my father, even though I couldn't make a living, but that's how it was. Till one day I said, that's it, I'm going on my own. I think we must have been married 3 years. I went on my own. And we struggled, but we built up. We built up.
How do you identify as a Jew today?
Maybe you can elaborate on that question.
What is your Jewish identity today?
What is my Jewish identity? I live in a Jewish neighborhood. I uh, I attend synagogue on a daily basis. My children are all Orthodox. I am Orthodox. My grandchildren are Orthodox. I know of no other way, nor do I want to know any other way. I'm very proud. I'm very proud to be an Orthodox and believing Jew. And I'm proud that my children and my grandchildren follow in my footsteps, and my parents and my in-laws' footsteps. And it's been generation after generation, and I identify very strongly with both being a Jew and with Israel.
Is there anything you'd like to add that I haven't asked you?
No, not really. I think you've taken out of me almost everything that I had, more than I thought I had, more than I thought I
Like
had.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm just going to reiterate again. I'm very proud of my children. I'm proud of each and every one of them that they raised their own generations just the way that mommy and I would want them to be. Every one of them, all four of them.
Please tell me all their names.
Sure. Moshe and Chani, my eldest, and Devorah and Leslie, my second, Brandy and Tommy, my third, and Isaac and Joyce, my fourth. And each and every one of them, I'm very proud of.
Do you have any grandchildren?
Oh, do I have grandchildren? Do I have grandchildren? Which grandfather doesn't brag about his grandchildren?
Please tell me their names.
My oldest grandson, well, I'll mention it according to the children's names. Moshe and Chani have a son, Aaron Yosef, who is an attorney. Next one is Eliezer. That's the second one. He's named after my grandfather. And the third one is Cheskel Shraga, who's named after my father. And then there's Dina, the love of their life. And Devorah and Leslie, the oldest son is Cheskel Shraga, named after my father. Second one is Eliyahu Sholem. The third one is Sorla. The fourth one is Batsheva. Fifth one is Aviva. No, fifth one is Duvid. Sorry, Duvid. And the sixth one is Aviva. In Brandi, the oldest one is Dovi. Next one is Yehudit. And then there's Arya He's named after my father-in-law. And the fourth one is Isaac and Joyce. And the first one is Sarah Eliza. Next one is Daniela. And the third one is Dina. And Dina, she's the one that is most like Isaac. She's the one that I promised Isaac. At least one like you. And I think everybody in the family knows exactly what I'm talking about. She's some kid.
And I understand you have some great grandchildren also.
Yes. I have Uva. These are Chaskel's and Simi's children. Ahuva and Shana. And then I have one from Aaron Yosef, and that's Leah. And they're the beginning of many, many more. Yes, Hashem.
I'd like to thank you for your testimony.
You're very welcome. I thank you for the privilege.
Who is this?
This is a picture of my father, Chaskel Shraga Weiss. I believe it must have been taken in 1917 during the First World War. He was a soldier in the German-Austrian army, and I believe he was called a Feldwebel, which is equivalent today to a corporal. He was wounded during the war. He received a bullet in his lower arm, right above the wrist, and he always carried the hole in the arm.
And how did you get this picture?
How did I get this picture? I stole it, probably. I took it from his album, like my children have been doing. They're stealing my pictures, and I hope that one day they'll return them.
And who is this?
This is a picture of my father and mother who took a trip to Europe after the war. I believe it must have been in early 50s, maybe 51, 52, on the Queen Elizabeth. And it was taken on the boat on the way home.
Could you state their full names?
Yeah, my father's Chaskel Weiss, and my mother's name is Sephora. And as of today, she is living and well. She is now Kanahoa 95, and she's still as pretty as she used to be.